I mix what I like, what I like.
I mix what I like is exactly where you want and need to be. I mix what I like, organic, vegan, soul food from your immediate diet. Get healthy.
I mix what I like, what I
We're
like.
here on I Mix What I Like. You may check us out on imixwhatilike.org, where you can see all these other shows and what my daddy liked and other cool things.
What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Liberation Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. Happy Monday morning. Hope all is at least relatively well. Again, off the top, this is pre-recorded. I'm on my way to that strong 4-4, as I say. Shout out. Although I don't know if I could do that anymore. Shout out to Biggie though. But the only 4-4 I carry is a course load. So, but I have a great show lined up featuring a discussion you about to see here in a minute. But just quickly, please do like, share, subscribe, put this in your socials, support the Patreon, do all of the things, blackliberationmedia.org. Thank you for your continued support. Please go back and check. Did you see the mix Ear Doctor popped up with yesterday? Did you see Saturdays with Renee? Make sure you have the bell rung so you don't miss stuff around here. Yeah, so welcome. Big shout out to the remixers who are here live, to those who will see and hear this later. Big shout out to you as well. But let's get to it because long overdue. It's been too long. And it's always good to catch up with my next guest, who, among many other things, is a radical cultural worker and a member of the Greensboro Revolutionary Socialists. He serves as an adjunct professor in African American and diaspora studies at UNC Greensboro. His work has been published in the African American Review, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the Journal of Black Masculinity, Socialism, and Democracy, Works and Days, Cultural Logic, Rampant Magazine, and other leftist publications. And most recently, with the good brother Chenjerai Kumanyika, he's the author of Lessons from Decades of Black and Palestinian Organization, published in the most recent issue of Hammer and Hope. And of course, I'm talking about my main man, Demetrius Noble, aka D Noble, in the building. What's good, my man? Good to see you again.
Hey, it's good to be here, brother. Good to be here.
How you been, man? Or how are you doing, as I should say, given the state of things and the state of the world? It's been, I don't know, a couple months since we've seen each other, and too long since we've wrapped in these kinds of environments. But yeah, how are things?
So I would say, on a personal note, you know, I'm alive, I'm healthy, I'm here, right? The family's well, so you know, we'll check off the box for that. I think given the larger state of the world, you know, these are trying times. Some days are better than others. I think one thing that's really keeping me grounded right now is staying in close community with comrades, with folks I organize with folks I build with, try to sharpen, you know, my own sensibilities continuously in terms of political education and ideological struggle. And I think for me, that's really been paramount in terms of just helping me stay grounded and not overcome with despair or feeling burnt out. I've had comrades that, you know, have succumbed to that. And it's natural, right? You know, this is a long, protracted fight. And there are certainly moments where folks go really hard without a lot of wins, right? Or things, you know, especially depending on how we define winning. And that can be draining and taxing. And, certainly with Trump posed to return, right-wing authoritarianism, on the rise. He has achieved the full gambit, if you will, with the Senate, the House. Obviously, the Supreme Court was long in motion as they executed their strategy for building out those various flanks of power. And we on the left are not as strong, right? And so I think for me, it's just a matter of how am I, balancing between those various things, shit. And the nigga still got to go to work, still got to go to the grocery store, still got to pay this mortgage amongst all these other things. So shit is real, right? And so it's just I guess the best way to kind of answer that is use the Most Def line. We say, how you doing, Most? He said, I'm a beautiful mess. A black man in America, the usual stress.
So it's interesting you did that. I'll just skip around a little bit because I was going to ask you if we're going to get some performance from you, because I don't know if you I don't, yeah, but I'm down if you got stuff you want to spit. We can start off with something and then come back to more later if you want.
I'm down for that. I'm
I mean, we can. Whenever you're ready, you take it away. Because as I said at the beginning, among many other things, and I don't think I would be doing you or any of us any favors by omitting the fact that you are a poet, an MC, so you rock as well on a mic doing a performance, or whether it's intellectual, it's the whole thing with you. So yeah, anyway, whenever you're ready,
all right, well, I'll open with this piece, especially since I think we're gonna get into the article I co-authored with Chandra around Black and Palestinian solidarity. And this is a piece I wrote earlier this year, trying to wrap my mind around such. This piece is actually entitled For Them, For Us, a poem for Palestine, a poem for the world to come. And before I get into the poem, I actually want to engage some epigraphs for some radical Black leftists that served as a grounding for me to get into this. The first is from George Jackson, Blood in My Eye. Come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered, half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution. And then from Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury. Poetry is not only dream and vision. It is the skeleton architecture of our lives. It lays the foundations for a future of change, a bridge across our fears to what has never been before. And then lastly, from Chairman Fred Hampton, you have to understand that people have to pay the price for peace. If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. And if you dare not struggle, then God damn it, you don't deserve to win. Let me just say, peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. For them, for us, a poem for Palestine, a poem for the world to come. If I can block out the hypocrisy that passes for political punditry, maybe I can push past two-party pomp and pageantry and register the savagery. If I can summon the discipline to dispel distractions, perhaps then radical chants from student encampments will dismantle my perceived powerlessness. If I can harness the restlessness and rage metastasizing in rib cage of this imperialist beast, I could hear the screams and shrieks rising from Gaza's streets. And if I can hold still and summon the solidarity and will to listen intently past propaganda and beyond bombs blast, then I could decipher between ghastly screams and defiant shrieks. And within that chorus, I can hear a bloody child speak amid the ruin and wreckage of Rafa's rubble, her voice inexplicably steady from the war-torn darkness of a tattered tent shanty town. She calls out to me with a demand. The poets must give us imagination of peace to oust the intense familiar realities of settler colonialism. Peace. Not only the absence of genocide, but peace. Peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it is made, can't be known unless it is through the active words of its making, lexicon of liberation, syntax of solidarity, rhetoric of resistance, morphology of movement, grammar of revolution, and inclination of verse to inertia. Amplified to agitation until twinge of terror is felt throughout global body. Let no Novocaine numb neurons of new world transmitting messages of hope and rebellion under dead flesh of this one. We faintly feel it. Sometimes an irregular offbeat pulse is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning, decoding, and encoding them as we speak, as we do, as we organize. Moreover, as we visualize the world we will fundamentally make over, the new world we will create and shape out of love at the horizon of our victory. Then, within that process, a line of peace drafts itself. A stanza of people power emerges and takes shape. If we restructure the paragraphs our lives are making, revoke reaffirmations of profits over people, denounce the dictator's definition of democracy, question our needs, meditate on our wildest hopes and dreams, dare to taste freedom for ourselves and name it, allow long pauses to continuously recalibrate and learn as we unlearn and become undone. Then, within that space and expansive opening, a fresh cadence of peace plays in the chasm, promises to balance its weight on a new scale, a new free jazz of justice measures meter our words land and swing on. Our new lives are new poems, salvaged and forged from the old world we burned as we march into the new one we make. Peace. An idea and concrete energy feel more intense than war and genocide. Peace, an aspiration and material reality more permanent than famine, despair, and terror. Peace, the personified poem of our promises kept to one another, shall post stanza by stanza into the world, each act of living, one of its words, each word a vibration of a new reality that we are forcing into existence. Peace.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
Right on, my man. Thank you very much for that. Yes, indeed. Yeah, excellent work, man.
Yeah, thank you for creating a space for that.
No, anytime. And I should have had this ready too. Yeah. Let's get some of that in there too. Get some finger snaps and whatever. By the way, so just quickly, what is the state of the Black radical poetry scene? Are you tapped in? Are you what's yeah?
It's interesting, right? In some ways, I've always kind of felt on the outside
Hmm.
of like the spoken word circuit, because my poetry has always had a political core. And
Hmm.
I had more entree and access, I would say, before I became, a communist, right? When it
Imagine
was
that.
Yeah, when it was more like black nationalist poetry, I think those ideas, the ideological thrust of the poetry was easier for folks to grasp,
Mm.
in terms of just how they were normally kind of understanding the world through a racial prism, um, exclusively, I might dare say, right? And as
Mm.
my ideas became more complicated, with the leftist analysis, and then frankly began to challenge a lot of those black nationalist thoughts, I actually saw I wasn't getting invited to many places as I used to, wasn't being asked to feature as much. But in a thankful way, what that did do is kind of created, where I was welcome was at sites of struggle, right? And at radical organizations. So it was interesting. I think in my own kind of trajectory as an artist, it became less like being invited to like coffee houses or like places where people would go for poetry, for entertainment. And then you might have some kind of idea of like black progressive or black nationalist poetry serve as the political menu amongst the love poems and and the other things that get the finger snaps. It was like I began to just get invited to picket lines or protests or places where people engaging in like political education and wanted some culture to help augment that stuff. So that's certainly not to say that I'm alone. And I think even other poets are starting to radicalize around what's happening in the world, because sometimes that's just inevitable, right? Like the world is moving, and sometimes will not allow your art to stay where it was currently situated. You become unsettled. So I've seen even some artists that have also been challenged and are moving in a more radical kind of direction. But in terms of the state of like black radical poetry overall, we need more of it, man. We need more of it. One of the things that I think that I've been increasingly understanding in terms of like how people respond to the direness of this moment is that the left is not only not powerful right now, we're unappealing, right? Like our ideas simply don't have traction, right? And so I think the art, cultural production, cultural workers are one of the ways in which you just are able to disseminate our ideas about the world we want and how do we get there and alternate visions for being that's really needed. So, I think we definitely need a cadre, of revolutionary workers, black poets, filmmakers, visual artists, the whole gambit to really help to try to or premiere our ideas about different ways of being a new world to come, and how we get there. Without it, you see people, placing their faith in bullshit like Kamala Harris or the Democrats, or you see a widening contingent of like you know folks of color and certainly the white working class, and they're in the growing right-wing populism, place their stock in Trump. These people aren't necessarily unorganizable, right? All of these folks are not foaming at the mouth like Nazis and rabid racists. Like these people want material change, and they rightly recognize that the Democrats are fucking bankrupt. You know what I mean? And so they're looking for something like this. This right wing populism certainly has a basis in a material reality and people suffering and wanting some sort of change. And so, I think the larger question is like, where's the left? Where are the cultural workers that can give our ideas real traction? You know what I mean? In moments of crisis, people look for the ideas that are laying around to try to make sense of the world. And our ideas seem invisible at worst and unappealing at best.
There's a lot there. At some point, I don't know if this is the time, but at some point I do want to get back into some discussions more directly, trying to collapse some of the nationalist materialist divide.
Yeah, for real.
I feel like I've been a victim, a purveyor, a witness, of all of it. At one point or another, and at one point I was trying to be more aggressive but yeah, I don't like hearing that a Black communist wouldn't be invited or welcomed or is welcome in certain nationalist spaces. The flip side is also true for me, that certain forms of nationalism or nationalist expression just get pushed out of materialist spaces. So I struggle with that, but and that is something that comes up in the piece you've written a little bit here, but it's linked in the show description. Before I get to any of my questions or comments, and by the way, you of course can say whatever you like in response to that, and you can always come back, whenever. But I did, in terms of just turning to this Hammer and Hope piece, before I get to any from me, what is it that you all were trying to do here? What is it that you are meaning to convey in this piece?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. I think a couple of things, right? Perhaps to start, we were invited to write something. So that particular episode of Hammer and Hope was really meant to serve as kind of like a special election issue, right? What is the left saying, a Black left, about, this particular moment when you have the prospect of a Black or biracial, woman, at the helm of empire, right? Or fighting to be, right? Against the backdrop of like ongoing genocide, multiple imperialist theaters of war, crisis in capital as austerity politics are just eating working folks alive, at every twist and turn. I'm super thankful to Chinjira Kumanyika, because to keep it a buck, he was really presented with the idea to write about this. And he was like, if I can rock with my boy D, he was like, we'll do it. And so they were agreeable to that. And so as we thought about this and saying like, well, what do we want to say about this particular topic, was a couple of things that were top of mind for us. One, we wanted to demonstrate that there is a history of of a radical Black tradition in solidarity with Palestine, right? Like, this isn't a new phenomena. This isn't something that Black folks are being asked to do right now, at the detriment to us, right? And I think so often that's how it was really phrased in corporate media, right? That to support these efforts of anti-genocide, or at the bare minimum asking for a ceasefire or arms embargo, is somehow going to help give rise to fascism here, right? To Trumpism here, as if the Democrats aren't already helping to lay the groundwork in way more effective fashion, some might say, than Trump ever could in terms of fascism, right? I'm reminded of Glenn Ford, rest his soul, states of like the more effective evil, right? His formulation of Obama as the more effective evil. In many ways, we can see that continuum post-Obama as well in terms of the Democrats. So one, we wanted to demonstrate that there is a history of a radical Black tradition, a Black left in solidarity with Palestine, and that's part of an international solidarity and anti-imperialist, anti-empire politic. Two, what we really wanted to demonstrate is that while these may appear to be separate fights, right, appear to be distinct, disparate fights, they are intrinsically linked, right? The broader imperial structure of empire creates like core linkages that we can't disentangle without like abstractions and falsities. What's going on with Black life here and what's going on in Palestine or the Congo or Sudan or Haiti, right? All of these things are intrinsically bound up in the imperial structure of empire. So a huge part of the article was to try to demonstrate what are contemporary fights going on on the ground here, domestically in the U.S., in which grassroots organizers and activists understand that linkage, right? And they understand that fighting for us here necessarily means fighting for Palestinian survival and resistance and liberation abroad. And that was really important to us, right? Because we wanted to make sure that the notion of solidarity with Palestine wasn't based on simply a moral one, right? That this isn't about your moral outrage. Like we need that too, right? Like we should be morally outraged when we see videos now well over a year of children being maimed and murdered and starved and thirsted to death, right? Like that should necessarily conjure some sort of moral outrage, but solidarity can't be built on moral outrage alone, right? And so what we really wanted to demonstrate, and hopefully we were convincing and effective on this front, is that there are real material linkages. Like there is a solid connective tissue that binds all of us together, right? And the clearer we are on understanding that, I think serves a couple of points that I hope were, if not made, at least inferred, is that when people kind of understand those concrete material linkages, people are then more empowered to fight, right? Like part of the reasons why so many folks are apathetic is because they don't understand what they can do about something, right? Like beyond being just crushed at seeing a hospital bombed and, you know, children blown up. Well, what can I do about that? I can barely afford groceries, right? You know, or, you know, rent done went up again and I can't, if I don't come up with this extra $300, we gonna get evicted in a couple of months, right? Like, you know, without understanding those linkages and how I can fight back for shit here and how that's connected to there, it's not just the apathy, it's just the defeatism. Like people just really succumb to the weight of the political moment. I think sometimes even on the left, we write that off as people being apathetic, but it's really just a lack of understanding of like how I could fight, what I could do, right? And so what we really wanted to demonstrate, like these are real fights going on right here. You know, we tried to narrow the focus to battleground states, you know, specifically, just also to kind of highlight just the bankruptcy of the Democratic Party, right? So while their strategy was simply to ignore the genocide that they're facilitating, right, and to ignore people's moral outrage at that, because overwhelming polling data demonstrated that Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike overwhelmingly wanted a ceasefire and an arms embargo. Now, for varying reasons, but that's almost beside the point. They wanted it, right? And the Democrats simply ignored it. So what we also wanted to demonstrate in these things, according to their own electoral political calculus, right? In the states that they said they needed the most as their pathway, their map to victory, we wanted to demonstrate that core constituencies of their base understand these linkages, are organizing and fighting. And if the Democrats would at least just give lip service to these fights on the ground, that they probably would have a more clear pathway to victory. And we see they did the opposite, and she got washed. Trump won not only electoral college, but the popular vote. This is the first time a Republican won the popular vote in 20 years. And they made a clean sweep, as I mentioned earlier, the House, the Senate. So those were a couple of things that we really wanted to try to demonstrate in the article. And then lastly, I think this is the point that you were alluding to earlier. We also wanted to map out, like, what's at stake for the left right now, right? Like, I can't tell you how many conversations, group chats that I was a part of, even amongst like comrades. I'm talking like dedicated socialists, communists, where people were really falling out with one another over this question of like, what are we going to do in this electoral moment, right? And so what we were also really fearful of in various conversations that Chinjarai was having is like, we can't afford to fracture. We can't afford to get smaller and more pure over some of these questions, because there's a larger protracted fight that we have to engage in. And in some ways, we're going to have to figure out these ideological and these tactical differences actively within the throes of struggle to better coalesce, to become stronger, bigger, more powerful, so we can confront and conquer power. Like, that's what we got to do. So those are some of the multiple tiers that we were after in trying to write the article. I guess, I'd love to hear your feedback in terms of, how effective or convincing we were, if there were things that we missed or didn't fully account for. So, your critical feedback would be good. That's part of the work. You put it out there, and then you engage with comrades to see, was it productive, or were there blind spots? Were there things we missed? So, I certainly welcome your critical perspectives as well. But that's what we were after, to answer your question.
No, I don't have any major issues. I largely agree and appreciate what you all were doing. I enjoyed the piece, and in fact, you touch on a couple of things that, as I'll ask here in a moment. And it looks like on my end, I'm gonna have some choppy video, so I apologize again, folks. This pre-recording with StreamYard and Chrome got to figure this out. This is not my fault. I just refuse to. But anyway, first of all, one thing I've always appreciated from Fanon is his argument around what people call apathy is really a response to the colonial inertia.
Yes,
that that's what I've always liked. So we don't stop targeting people for being apathetic. It's a perfectly logical, even unconscious response to what's going on here. And it's quote unquote our job to create the alternative and the change there. So I don't like, so I appreciate your point there. One thing, the only thing that I think I may end up having a disagreement with in terms of it's not even a disagreement, and it's premature because I didn't read everything, but there was one part, and I'm skipping ahead now since you invited the criticism, because there was only one part where I kind of raised an eyebrow, where you all talk about Dr. King and his engagement with Israel. And as I tried to cover a little bit myself, others in these associated spaces have too, especially when the Zionists were trying to use him to garner support for Israel. Is he was very explicit in saying, if you really want to correct the problem, Israel has to end the occupation.
Right.
So I just wanted to make that emphatic point, and I'm not sure. I know the piece you all have links to a piece with to Dr. Purnell. I didn't read it. So I don't know to what extent she engages that, and I hope she does. So that was my only, and I don't want I know, she and I had a little exchange. I don't want to get, invite no more, the one, so I'll leave it at that. I'll just say that I hope that she addressed that, because I didn't get a chance to fully read the piece that was linked there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair call out, and I think in the piece we probably didn't flesh that out as well as we could have, but we did make mention that his thoughts around it were complex, so
Yeah.
certainly to kind of raise that point that he was against the occupation, but also stated like the right of Israel to exist. So there were certainly some complexities.
Yeah, he was struggling. Yeah.
Yeah, he was struggling, right? And obviously what we know is they killed him, right? So,
Right. Well, let's not, right.
So
Let's not,
King's,
yeah.
who knows where he ultimately would have wound up,
Right.
On the issue as he continued to develop his own anti-imperialist, politic, which he, and that was the real reason they moped him out. If we want to keep it hot, like King, he was going beyond the borders of liberalism, right? And he was starting to develop a critique of empire and imperialism, and they was like, nah, we can't have this. So who knows where he ultimately, wound up with us. I think his trajectory certainly suggests that, he would have been certainly super anti-Zionist, had he had the opportunity to continue to live and fight for liberation. One thing that I've always been impressed with Dr. King is his commitments to Black liberation struggle empowered him to be so self-critical, right? Is he's always kind of looking back, like, what did we do? How do we get here? Were we effective? Are we on the right track? Do we need to course correct and pivot? Like, his commitment to Black liberation struggle necessitated that kind of ferocious critique of himself and what he was doing. So I have no doubt where he would have wound up at. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's the only reason I wanted to be more. I want that emphasis is because of this attempt by Zionists to say no, he's on our team. He's like, nah, absolutely not, absolutely
right,
not.
Right.
But you do in the first paragraph of the article. I admit my biases were fully on display because you start off in the first paragraph, you're already talking about Black Christian Zionists and calling into all of this, which I think is an under-discussed part of it, is people's, underneath all of the claims politically and whatever people say on TV is for many an actual belief in the biblical stories and myths. And I know this isn't exactly where you all were going, but I think you raise that as an issue. And say, Look, man, people really believe in this stuff, man. And they really believe that God did this and said that this is the land for this. And Jesus is coming back and wiping everybody out. So whether you're a Jewish Zionist, a Christian Zionist, a Muslim Zionist, people are invested at a spiritual, and I think it's no disrespect, irrational level. So it's like you're not just calling into question imperialism and a certain material politics. You're really starting to mess with people's core beliefs at the highest level. So I don't know. I don't have a question there, but I would invite any response or further thoughts on that, and maybe why did you all think that it was important to make reference to that?
Yeah, no. Precisely for those reasons, that you highlighted. So it was really interesting as Chinjira and I were, developing the piece, we had so many different possible directions in which we thought about going, right? And to this point that you're raising, right now, when we, we're thinking about, because at one time we thought that maybe we would just do kind of like extensively like this history, right? Of like, this question of Zionism and Palestine in terms of like Black liberation struggle before we, decided to anchor it in some other ways, but wanted to offer some history. But to the point that you're making, not only is it a core kind of spiritual belief, even in theological frameworks in which you have this Black tradition of folks trying to leverage Christianity towards this more liberatory capacity, like Black liberation theology, the Zionist framework is really built into it. If you read Dr. James Cone and Black liberation theology, all of this stuff about Jesus and the Jews is central to his work. In many ways, the whole notion of like God's chosen people and using the Jews as an allegory for Blacks in America are intrinsically tied together. So I think even in ways in which you have these more radical elements of Black Christianity in terms of like Black liberation theology, these Zionist seeds are there, right? And so you have folks that can be really committed to a Black liberation struggle, or at least, a Black civil rights, racial justice, racial empowerment framework in which this notion of Zionism is in bed with them, right?
So like so just to switch from the article, and for some reason the highlights, I don't know what's going on. When I pull up to share it logs me out and I can't share my highlights. So from the article. So I just wanted to, again, the link to the pieces of the show description, everybody, please make sure you check it out. It's pleasantly not short and rich and well written. I should add too, by the way. Shout out to the both of you for that, and your editing, whoever. I don't know I don't know the process, but whoever helped put all that together is very well written.
Yeah. Shout out to the Hammer Hope editing folks. Yeah.
Yeah. But just to switch back and forth a little bit, because you do a lot of your work is in actual grassroots organizing.
Uh-huh.
How do you find this issue translate in terms, in other words, when you're doing community work or you're trying to build and bring people into various certain politics, do you find people's religious commitments being at all an issue, especially around this issue, this topic area?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Personally, I haven't come across it being like a huge hurdle in terms of like some of those kind of connections that we were just discussing. If anything, the larger kind of obstacle that I've seen around, trying to organize or build out the solidarities, with Palestine is really just more so around like ignorance that people have about like what's going on in general, right? So, or their only source of information comes from, corporate media, and the propaganda and spin there is obscenely, pro-Zionist, right? And so that has really been more of the challenges that I've encountered, as opposed to these really kind of deep spiritual investments. I also think part of that may be part of a generational kind of split. Like I grew up in a Black Southern, Christian church. So I'm very familiar with all of those things we were just talking about. And so I imagine like if you were probably trying to organize like an older generation of Black folks, like my parents or younger, or somewhere between like me and my parents, that would become way more of a fraught kind of enterprise. But it seems like with younger folks, if folks have become, it seems anyway, like less invested in all of those types of spiritual things. Like the church is still a really important kind of institutional space, but it doesn't seem that it's carrying those same types of political weights and investments as it used to. And then I think also when you just think about like how many more younger folks are drifting towards alternate medias, whether that be like a TikTok or like leftist kind of IG pages in which there's the opportunity and space that's being carved out for more leftist analysis and coverage around what's happening there, it's creating some real traction and irritants, if you will, where CNN is saying this, but these people over here are saying this, and they seem like really smart and know what's going on. So, one thing that I've actually been really pleasantly surprised, like, some folks who recognize the type of work I do have reached out and just be like, man, I've been seeing these posts and this on TikTok. Like, what's your take? And so I've had quite a bit of like proactive kind of discussion just based on like other media that folks have seen that's floating out there, on the socials. And then they're trying to tap in with folks who they, have observed, have been doing, other types of like, kind of organizing and work. And then they're like, well, let me see what he thinks about this. Is this crackpot stuff, or is this like really legit analysis, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I appreciate that. So just so we can, let me move along. I'm already seeing I'm taking up all the time here with so another thing that you raised again right out the gate that was very important to me as an issue is the role of the historically Black college and university.
Yes.
And the way that the Black college student is, as you write here, the console made it clear that the Black college students would be an especially important target for this project that is in promoting Israel's Israeli consulate in Atlanta to promoting Israel and Zionism to Black communities. And you said that it would be, as you write here, it would be that they recognize that the Black college student would be an important target, as you all write, for this project, while recognizing that Israeli officials would face accusations of discrimination for reaching out to them on integrated college campuses. So could you talk a little bit about this specific or particular targeting of HBCU and Black college students in the endeavor of defending Israel?
Yeah, so I really appreciate this question. And so what you see, in this moment, and that wasn't isolated to that historical period, right? So we actually, like right now to this day, there's this whole Zionist institution, like a whole organization like the Maccabee Task Force, that's like designed to go onto college campuses and recruit American students to Zionist politics and projects. And they have a whole dedicated wing to HBCUs. And they actually have, so one thing that they don't have to worry about now that they were worried about then is they can actually go onto the PWIs now and specifically target the Black students. So one thing that came out in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, and as we discussed in our piece, right, when you start to saw like some of those solidarities being forged again between Ferguson and Palestine, there was, people can Google this, right? It's out there, right? That they were really worried that a larger wave of Black youth would become sympathetic to pro-Palestinian politics and organizing. And they wanted to supplant that. So they wanted to beef up their presence, the Maccabee Task Force, on HBCUs and even on PWI, specifically going after Black students. So that is not just like a historical throwaway. That's something that's actively going on to this day. Within the last several years, they had like a huge conference. I believe it was like out in Las Vegas that they put on, and they had like all these Black delegates from these various college campuses on these student unions who were actively out recruiting folks to Zionist projects, and they got like recognized and awarded. And they're really, what you see is it's becoming another layer of a Black misleadership class, right? That they're actively developing. So earlier when I was talking about like the left, not being as powerful. They have whole organizations that they're actively cultivating, building out long-term strategies, right? So in the same way that I was talking about, we need a cadre of left cultural workers, they're actively developing the cadre now of a Black misleadership class. And these folks are probably going to matriculate and go into various leadership, civic, political institutions and have sway over larger swaths of Black working class people to try to reorient them in a Zionist direction as opposed to an anti-imperialist, anti-empire type critique. So, and that was something, to be honest, as we was working on, I wasn't aware of that. So that was something that I learned, as we were developing this piece. And it really just functions in a way to kind of continuously demonstrate how sophisticated our enemies are in terms of really building out their ground game and their long-range strategy for ongoing assaults on us. These things are not by happenstance. These things just didn't crop up. Like, they're actively developing an agent of Black youth to serve as a misleadership class against us, in the future. Have you seen the Boots, Riley, Sorry to Bother You movie?
Of course.
So it's like the
Of
part
course.
where Armie Hammer character Steve Lift is talking to Cassius and telling him way in advance, like, we want you to be the head Equisapien because we anticipate that some point down the line they'll develop their own culture and probably want to resist, and we need to go ahead and have an agent that grows up amongst them to quell that. Like, this is a really good example of that, right? Where they're thinking like 4 steps ahead of the game.
Yeah, I mean, oh man, I always blank out on that. But the Crossing book that I got put onto some years ago, anyway. But yeah, the idea that military, state officials, elite academics would be specifically concerned about the radicalization of Black students on Black campuses is so I just and why people like me argue that we've seen the turn over the last 50 years, particularly at HBCUs, to assure that the Black capitalist class that you all end up referencing gets evolved.
Right.
But before I get to that point, I did want to sort of just chronologically going through the article. One of the next things you all raise is this the contradiction, as I wrote in my notes here, the Black nationalist contradiction. First of all, you refer, I don't know what kind of trouble and controversy you're trying to really kick off in these YouTube streets when you refer to Du Bois, Garvey, and Robeson as radical Black nationalists. So that was one thing. I was like, man, they're trying to poke all the bees' nests with that one. And then the second half of that sentence is you saying that they all at various times supported Zionism. So I was like, man, that's so. Could you talk a little bit about how is it, the definition of them as Black radical nationalists, which I thought it's like, yeah, but more importantly, this issue of why were so many well-meaning radicals in the Black and African world at various times tricked, confused, misunderstood a little bit. I don't know.
I think there's a concrete material reality for why those sensibilities were developing around those particular kinds of times. And there's a really good book by Keith Feldman called Shadow Over Palestine that really works to uncover this. He actually has a brilliant chapter in that book that's actually called Black Power's Palestine, in which he unpacks you know, a lot of this history. But to try to be concise, I think what Feldman is really does a really good job of demonstrating is that coming out of the World War situation, right? The Jewish state, the Zionist politic, were really able to seize upon the aftermath of the Holocaust, right? Which totally was like this kind of fascist fight. And for Black folks who are already engaged in fighting against American domestic terrorism, an apartheid, Jim Crow state, there are linkages that they are identifying in terms of like the material realities here and trying to map that parallel onto, you know, what occurred, you know, with the Jews. And so it's a way in which we see like this burgeoning international politic developing, right? And so as they're trying to trace that contour, they're sympathetic to the Jews as folks that were persecuted and oppressed by a racist, fascist regime, right? That's those parallels just could not be ignored in terms of the own fight that they were waging here, you know, in America. And so they supported it, because what they were really hoping to say by supporting this fight, they're hoping that they're able to use some of that as leverage for the Black American fight here, right? Now, ultimately, we know history shows that didn't work, and then it became fraught labor as the Zionist state became its own white supremacist, you know, ethno-nationalist, fascist regime. But those were legitimate I think legitimate ideas and seeds that they were really trying to nurture and trying to figure out, like in terms of the Black experience here and mapping this out here, and then seeing ways in which this was gaining purchase from the rest of the world. They were hopeful, right, that they could leverage this particular moment to say, all right, well, if you understand it in this capacity, right, could it be understood here as well as we continue to wage this Black liberation fight? And what are ways that we can attempt to try to leverage and seize upon this moment to advance our own political demands for justice, equality, trying to carve out space for us as citizens. And so that is all that's bound up, you know, in some of these earlier figures really looking towards Israel and the Zionist project and seeing it as an allegory, as a metaphor for perhaps what might be able to develop here, and really just trying to, I think, seize upon the fact that it has such ideological and political purchase throughout the world.
Right on. Fair enough, because you come right back in that same paragraph to say that right around the corner was that black shining prince, Malcolm X, who said, "Nah, son, nah, son." I peeked over there, I saw what was going on, and if my homeboy Dr. King will eventually not, you know, be as clear as I am, if some of my predecessors were maybe not as clear as I am, let me be clear.
Yes.
Zionism is a problem, it's colonialism, it's dollarism, and it's a mess. And then picking up right after him, you talk about someone who gets less attention in these histories, Ethel Minor. So could you talk a little bit about that sort of shift represented by those two?
Yeah. So again, what we see, you know, repeatedly is the way that X, you know, Brother Shabazz is kind of always seems like just radically ahead of the curve, right? The way that he's able to process information and contradictions, I think most importantly, is like not just information, but his ability to seize upon contradictions, get to the core of it, and then turn that into a politic, ideological germ that he's then running with. is phenomenal. That's why I always love Amir Baraka's formulation of Malcolm as ideology, right? He was like, we should study Malcolm's whole life as ideology because it was constantly developing and on the move. That's an aside. But yes, Malcolm is way ahead of the curve in saying that, Zionism is colonialism, and this represents a threat to the entire third world in this burgeoning anti-colonial upsurge that's happening in all of these globally in the moment. What we see is Ethel Minor, working at X's organization and being a student of him. She takes these lessons, right? And she engaged, and she's in Colombia working with anti-colonial fights there, and is harnessing all of this lived experience from her organizing as a Black American in Colombia, engaging in anti-colonial struggle, and takes this back to SNCC and say, and then hollers at Stokely and H. Rap Brown. It was like, yo, I think we ain't looking at things sharply. Like, let's get a reading group together. Again, political education to help underwrite the organizing, right? Like, these things have to be, coalesce. So that's another thing that, we hope was inferred, but let me just say it since you got me here to say it like really clear now. Like, your organizing has to be combined with political education, right? Like, it's a reason why these folks were able to make shifts and pivots, because they were also studying as they were working, right? It's theory and praxis. And so what Ethel Minor is able to bring to them, say like, yo, let's read together in community, let's study. And then these contradictions that X had seen start to crystallize and sharpen for them as well. And then they become undeniable by the time you get to the 6-Day War. And now they like, okay, yeah, we get it. Our understanding of Israel and perhaps the whole anti-colonial moment was severely impoverished, and we need to ramp it up because we now understand these core material linkages, what binds us all together. So Ethel Minor was crucial in helping to organize that space, that political community where that education could take root. And then, H. Rap Brown and Stokely become, two of the leaders of like this emerging Black leftist, Black power politic that folks like me and you are still pulling from today.
Constantly.
Big shout out to Ethel Minor.
Yeah. And thank you both for reminding us of Minor's contributions and presence.
Yeah, when they say trust Black women, like them the ones.
Yeah.
Them the ones, the Ethel Minors.
Yeah. So as I got excited in talking about, well, here, then Malcolm X shows up.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, the system has its own version of somebody showing up or some things showing up, and you start pointing to the rise and the push and the development of Black capitalism as in my language, a state-sponsored project of counterinsurgency. And you referenced the late great Robert Allen.
Yes.
And so it's like the predecessor of the phrase Glenn Ford popularized, Miss Leadership Class. This is really where they get there. So talk a little bit about what you all say here in terms of the rise, because actually, just to quote real quick, in the 1960s, the liberal and conservative wings of the ruling class agreed that the best way to counter the upsurge in Black militancy crystallized by the fiery waves of urban rebellions, as well as the revolutionary internationalist impulses growing among the Black left, would be to supplant these tendencies with the concomitant programs of Black capitalism and Black electoral representation.
Yeah.
Now listen.
And one more
message.
I mean, because that's what it is.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
So, I don't know if you get a better text than Robert Allen's Black Awakening in Capitalist America to outline this. And, you know, rest in power to the ancestor who just recently transitioned. But, you know, as I revisit that book a lot, you know, I teach one of the chapters in it damn near like every semester, like the Black imperialism, Black liberation versus corporate imperialism, chapter 5. I teach that damn near every semester. Is just so good. But what he was really understood, and JB, it's crazy. Like, he's writing this real time, bro. Like, that's another thing that just blows my mind. Like, in terms of like how sharp his analysis was. Like, it's theory now, but it's damn near journalism because he's writing it real time. So when you think about like not only his ability to capture all of this stuff, but synthesize it in an analysis so sharp that would be so productive for us 50, 60 years later, is crazy. But at any rate, you know, what Allen demonstrates is that both the right wing and the liberal wing of the ruling class had a fundamental understanding that the Black working class is not remaining docile under the current racial status quo, right? So they made the decision, because of the upsurge in of Black militancy and insurgency crystallized by damn near a decade of rebellions, to say like, we have to do something different because the status quo of Jim Crow white supremacy is going to buckle. And if we don't come up with an answer, the whole status quo is going to buckle with it. So what they then decide as the most favorable solution, because there were multiple things on the table, right? Like, it was continued state repression, right? Which was like, let's just kill them in the streets and bring out the tanks. But they saw the more they did that, that was only crystallizing and intensifying the Black militancy. So they had to abandon that. The other thought was, do we try to continue to expand the welfare state? That was too costly. They didn't want to do that. So then it was like, can we co-opt particular rhetorical and reactionary political factions of the Black Power movement, as expressed by Black capitalism, as expressed by this desire for enhanced political electoral representation, and then trying to make these the dominant expressions of Black power? Allen warned us real time that this is what they were doing, and that it was incumbent upon the Black left to find an alternate strategy, because he was so fearful that if we didn't, that these things would win out, and lo and behold, he was right. So everything that he anticipated, because it hadn't happened yet, these were his fears, his anticipations. And then within 50 years, they were able to consolidate and legitimately crystallize an upwardly mobile Black middle class, and then were able to partner that with real Black electoral power, right? And this is something that Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor speaks about really clearly in her book, from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, this latter front of like the Black electoral representation. And this isn't token power. This is real institutional power, and these folks sit on real committees. They write real public policy. And now what we see is we have a whole host of Black elected officials that are managing the suffering of the Black working class. They are managing the suffering of the Black working class, while also parroting certain talking points and rhetoric of Black radicals to appear as if they're fighting for us. And so that was one of the main contradictions that we were trying to raise in this point. And we see the Democrats actively evolving that playbook, where, think about the nonsensical nature of this, where the Palestinians' best hope is the party in administration that's actively facilitating the genocide. Like, this was really marshaled out to folks as a credible argument. Well, it's only going to get rushed with Trump. Like, what? They haven't done anything to restrain Netanyahu or the Zionist genocide. Not one fucking thing. And yet we were supposed to believe that the Palestinians' best hope was more of the same. Like that's absurdity on its face, right? And you see Kamala Harris in this way, Barack Obama in this way, becoming the extensions of this fear and deep anxiety that Robin Allen was writing about, 50 years ago, right? And Keeanga Yamada Taylor says, like, the consolidation and expansion of Black electoral power perhaps is the most interesting, and she didn't say bizarre, but I'm going to add that for her, bizarre development of Black life under American capitalism over the last 50 years. It's crazy. And I think we would really kind of understand that, like, these are the folks managing over Black suffering. That really should be I think our framework.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So you do touch on, I do want to make sure that to bring this in, because at some point you both well, let me just ask the question, because you touch on this in the article. Do you distinguish at all between anti-Black and xenophobic nationalism?
Can you say a little bit more?
Because at one point, because at one point you say, I'll find the exact quote here. You say, so you say, for instance, some Black activists point to the reality of anti-Black racism from Muslim and Arab people and are unclear about how their solidarity with faraway Palestine helps Black folks in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and back home in America. Unfortunately, Black folks are not immune to the lure of xenophobic nationalist solidarity. So, of course, I heard, what I'm reading at, I'm hearing, this is a shot at Afro-pessimism, my guy Frank. That's how I heard it, at least.
Yeah.
And I consistently disagree with how folks represent his argument and his analysis, particularly around the point about Palestine. So that's why I brought him back to the platform, whatever, a couple of years ago, to clarify this point, to because I try to talk about it with Nora Ericott, you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to, like, it's because this interview that I did with him keeps getting circulated, and because I got a Google alert, I keep seeing it, and people keep using it to say, see, Frank, and then by much lesser extension, Jared, are not supporting Black solidarity with Palestine. And I'm like, that's not what's being said here. That's not the point. So that's at least how I read that. So that's why I wrote the question, because in this moment, there is a collapsing of concern with anti-Blackness in the world and xenophobic nationalism. So that's why I'm asking it the way I do. Do you at all ever distinguish between anti-Black criticism of the world and something that I would say is separate as a xenophobic nationalism? Does that make more sense?
Yeah, it does. It does.
Okay.
Yeah, and so those are certainly different manifestations of oppression, but I do think they have a what we might call a central kind of force that they emanate from, which is like racial capitalism, right? Like, so, there's no way that we can talk about anti-Blackness without talking about, like, the white supremacist contours of, of racial capitalism, and certainly the xenophobic, nature, at least in America, certainly emanates from that same point. And that's one of the things that Trump has been masterful at wielding, right? Like, his ability to scapegoat all the crises and contradictions of capitalism onto these other colored bodies of folks and places, right? Like, he's been really masterful at that. And I think the the central germ in both of those is just like the total racist, anti-black nature of like racial capitalism. So I mean, and maybe in some ways, I do agree that they're separate phenomenons, but like it might be even more helpful to say that the anti-black kind of core of racial capitalism then gets extended into this kind of larger xenophobic kind of project of America. You know, I'm thinking about that kind of for the first time per the question. So, you know, don't hold me to that. You know, I might reformulate that later, but yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's again, you know, because really what my and so on the one hand, I would want people who are sensitive to the fact that issues in the Sudan, Congo, here in the US, as it relates to African people, are not being properly addressed and are not given maybe ever the level of attention given to the issues of Israel and Palestine. So I don't want to ever condemn them for saying, yo, what about what's going on over here?
Right.
Even recognizing where anti-blackness plays a role in suppressing those stories. Like I don't want that to be any of that to be collapsed with a xenophobic nationalism that
Gotcha.
just some conservative nationalist, you know, if you're not black, you don't count type of thing. And so there's got to be a way for those who recognize that problem to be heard without being condemned as xenophobic nationalists or narrow conservative nationalists. At the same time, I wouldn't want anybody in those groups to say that's why we shouldn't be concerned with or in solidarity with Palestinians. There's got to be some elevated level of discussion analysis. So that's, I just admitting a bias and a sensitivity. So when I read that, I was like, oh, there they go. They taking another shot at Frank and them. And I was like, so, but so that's why, to be fair, I wanted him to be clear. What are you saying about Palestine and your point about Afro-pessimism and anti-blackness? And then, which I don't think is being heard. And then also, you know, but at the same time, recognizing that not only is there at times a conservative nationalism, but there's a fraudulence in some cases that I wouldn't want to call out because I can't fully prove that it's fraud. In other words, there seems to be a performance in some spaces of pay more attention to me and my platform and my bona fides as a black radical pundit, because I'm telling you, my black audience, not to care about Palestinians because we only should be, you know, there's like a performance in that too. Anyway, I just that was it. So I just wanted to
and I think just to kind of clarify, because I really appreciate this point, you know, that's not something that we were, you know, subtly hitting on. What we were actually really addressing in that particular sentence is ways in which American black folks are susceptible and vulnerable to the xenophobia, you know, to
of the U.S. You mean?
Right.
I see. US. I got you.
Right,
I got you.
And so, you know, we see that, you know, there were, you know, Trump was able to peel off, you know, larger factions of black folks to, you know, some of these kind of xenophobic remarks as they, you know, bought the bullshit of like, you know, perhaps their own material circumstances are as bad because of what America is giving to, you know, these various kind of immigrant populations. And you don't need Trump to say that because you got fucking Eric Adams saying that every other day. You have black elected officials saying that every other day. And so, you know, there is, I mean, hell, Kamala Harris said it, right? So her choice wasn't to deny the core assumptions and suppositions of what Trump was saying. She was just saying, she was saying, I have a heart attack on it, right? So in many ways, I think one of the long-lasting legacies of the Democrats' disastrous campaign this particular election cycle is ways in which they legitimized all of these really right-wing talking points that now, you know, unless something really different occurs, like they have legitimized it to such an extent that, the whole playing field and terrain of the electoral arena has shifted so far right that, what we're really dealing with now is like two Republican parties, right? Where like one is like, some form of like a Bush Reagan Republican, and then like the real cartoonish right wing extremism that Trump represents, as he's totally remade the contemporary Republican Party over into his image. And even after he disappears, we're still going to have to deal with, Trumpism, MAGA, Tea Party, all of those kind of right wing, used to be fringe elements, but are now the dominant face and expression of the party. And the Democrats have put no real opposition to that. They've only tacked further right. So it even makes the prospects for the left even more urgent in this moment, because now the electoral choices are between two right-wing parties.
No, right on. Another way that the point is made is in another issue you all bring up, which is in other words, another way that this point is made, that people in the United States, particularly working people, should not have the levels of concern for Palestinians that they logically should, is by promoting, maybe even indirectly, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel through its business ties. So you all address, whether it's surveillance or this robot dog situation that you all talk about. Like there's a just one paragraph here. The financial firm BNY Mellon has offices in Atlanta and is one of the corporate landlords that are opponents of the Atlanta Housing Justice League. BNY Mellon directly profits from the genocide in Palestine through its investments in Elbit Systems and manages the Friends of Israel Defense Forces donor advised fund. Elbit, Israel's largest weapons company, produces drones, bullets, technology, and white phosphorus for Israel. So again, even indirectly, there's an attempt to promote, look, working people here in Atlanta and throughout the United States, your interests are served by preserving Israel, because we're literally paying you to create weaponry that destroys Palestinians. So if you better see them as savages deserving of it, sprinkle a little biblical mythology on top of that, and it seems like a win-win. So yeah, I appreciated seeing more and learning more about this, again, disturbing and incestuous business relationship between the military, police, surveillance, intelligence communities in the United States and Israel that is playing a part in this.
Yeah, and I think it's a real shout out to organizers on the ground in these respective locales that are highlighting these imperial symmetries, right? That are saying like, this isn't some distant fight over there. Like this, we're combating the same forces that are given expression to violence, to destruction of working class life in different ways, but they're emanating from these same sources, right? So like the case in Atlanta is just a really rich one when you think about like BNY Mellon. Like they're one of the biggest corporate landlords that have completely devastated the housing scene in Atlanta, right? Rents and mortgages have gone through the roof. There's been studies that also demonstrate like how this phenomenon is part of like what they call like the racial transitioning of gentrification, right? Though eviction through displacement is one of the primary tactics that they use to flip these neighborhoods from black to white as they continue to increase the rents. Atlanta Housing Justice League, and so it had a stat out one time that at one point there was like 1,000 evictions a day in Fulton County. Wow. 1,000 evictions per day in Metro Atlanta. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah, I can't even. I mean,
and so you're just seeing like mass displacement mass dispossession of working class black folk, and one of the main players is doing it is also benefiting from the genocide through their support, being a large shareholder of Elbit Systems and legit managing the Israel Advisor Defense Donor Fund. Like, you don't get a more kind of clear linkage than that. We didn't, we had a huge part about Detroit that actually got, for word space. We didn't even get to cover it, in the paper, but there's some organizers called We the People Detroit that have been fighting against the austerity measures going on in Detroit, with the water crisis there, the power system there, where austerity has just run rampant in Detroit, which is the blackest city in America, and the most segregated city in America. And so what We the People Detroit have also done is identified these common linkages between their fights against austerity and the water crisis and the electric crisis and mass displacement in Detroit to what's going on in Israel, right? And they actually have that part of one of their huge kind of organizer thing was from Detroit to Gaza. Like, that was the literal name of a huge kind of coalition and organizing campaign that they had built out. 10% of Detroit is without complete access to water. 10%. Like, no access to water. Water prices have gone up 140% in Detroit because the city went bankrupt and then put on the backs of working class black folks bailing out the city through the increased water and sewage bills. Meanwhile, the corporations have had their debts forgiven. And a huge part of those corporations in the Detroit area are war manufacturers. So, these are linkages that the people on the ground they're organizing are helping people to see, right? And I think, not for nothing, when you think about, Rashida Tlaib, who comes from that Detroit Dearborn, it's one of the reasons she was able to stand as the sole member of the squad who didn't sign on to the Biden nonsense and stood 10 toes down against the genocide. And she had no threat at all of losing her seat because of the amazing organizing work and consciousness that people in her district had. And she came from that. So she came out of that organizing thing, and We the People Detroit and We the People Michigan have really developed a very credible kind of electoral ground game to be an expression of their organizing. So to me, I think they're one of the really kind of good exemplars that we can think about as we think about how do we try to a long-term strategy for building out a pathway to governance as a part of our actual organizing and coalitional work.
So let's turn to that as we start to head to an unfortunate close of this conversation. But what is for you the pathway to good governance and all of these things? I did have that is one thing I wanted to ask you about. What do we do with electoral voting with voting? Where do you see this? What do you see? Yeah, go ahead. Let me just stop. Go ahead.
So the first thing I want to say is that if we're serious, on the left, we cannot cede this territory. We cannot completely cede the electoral arena and say, oh, that's bourgeois politics. It's two sides of the same coin. We're not going to engage it at all. I think that's silly. And I think it makes us look not serious to, the larger groups of people that we have to win over, right? En route to building up towards a straight up revolution to transform society, if we say that's our theory of change, we also have to be about the business of trying to win governance, because we got to win reforms along the way to enhance people's lives, because we're getting crushed. Part of another reason why that, what often gets written off as apathy is people are just spending all of their time and energy literally trying to survive. Like literally. Like that's that expression that we say so often in the Black community, trying to make something out of nothing, is not just a colloquialism for nothing. Like, people are literally trying to make something out of nothing, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents, literally trying to do the impossible every fucking day. So at some point, we actually have to be fighting for like real strategic campaigns to win reforms that's going to make the lives of working class folks easier, so they can have more capacity and bandwidth to fight. We also have to engage them in those fights, because when they win, their political imagination grows, their political appetite grows. You don't engage in a campaign and win, be like, oh, that was really cool. You say, nah, I want more. What's next? Right? So it becomes a very concrete mechanism and means to growing political vision, political appetites, also helping to expose the contradictions and the limitations of the system as it is. And even though as you're engaging it, people are radically and rapidly coming to the understanding of why the whole thing has to be done away with, right? So we cannot afford to simply say we're not going to engage the electoral arena at all. Now, we shouldn't say we're going to be sponsoring Democrats or Republicans or supporting or throwing like real organizational weight and resources behind candidates, but we absolutely should be engaging electoral politics, and we should, as it exists, through some of these other types of models where you actually have built out electoral vehicles that are extensions and expressions of organizing coalitions. I think that's the way forward, right? So you go out as your organization and you knock on doors and you engage people, try to figure out like, how are you thinking about voting? What's really important to you? Like, that's also how you build political community with people, right? As I was saying earlier, like, we don't even forget not being powerful. We ain't even appealing, right? So like, at least the process of like getting out, talking to people, knocking on doors gives you a real kind of more fundamental, clear idea of where the people are at. What are some of the kind of core assumptions and suppositions that are funding their worldview? Because that's what you ultimately have to engage if you want to try to win people over to a more radical and revolutionary politic and praxis, right? And so if we see that all together, I think we just going to be at best able to kind of spout off some sort of ideological and political purity and pretend as if we've like transcended the contradictions of, capitalist democracy, which is just silly, right? So like we have to engage that, because that's where the people are at. I think was one of the best ways we're going to be able to expose the contradictions, and it's going to give us a way better sense of like, what are the real campaigns that we should be fighting, trying to winning people over. And as we win some of these things, the political appetite and imagination grows. It becomes real hard and more difficult for Democrats to tell us what's practical and what we should be thinking about when we engage in these fights and we won something, or we see how much fight they put up against us for something they purportedly believe in themselves.
So do you have a preferred method or mechanism for doing this, for winning these small victories or campaigns? Is there a political party you advocate, or the development of one, or some other approach?
Yeah, I think we have to develop one. And so I think, to me, I don't have an answer to this question. I think this is one of the most serious kind of tactical questions out there for the left right now, right? Because we just do not have a viable third party that we can operate through and that can serve as an extension and expression, of our politics. I think one of the this is a legitimate critique of the Green Party, right? Is that while they're around and they have, I think, very solid kind of politics and talking points to address the real concerns, it seems like they only pop up every 4 years. You know what I'm saying, at election time. And so, the real, to me, another question, like, how are they growing power in the interim? Like, what other kind of grassroots organization coalitions are they attached to? Do they have any type of capacity or ability to win like down ballot races, to build out, like real kind of governance, power and strength that people can have some kind of faith and credibility in? You can't perpetually run as a disruptor and a purveyor of a particular type of ideological and political outlook. You know what I mean? So yes, we do need a third party. I think the real question is like, how do we build that out in the interim? And then how do we engage with the two-party kind of apparatus as it exists right now until we build that out? You have this other model like the Working Families Party and I'm not really fully aware of all the internal kind of contradictions and disagreements that's going on in the party, but from the limited bit that I see, I like their strategy or theory in practice, but in theory, but in practice, it seems like it's only running cover for the Democrats. It seems like it's really used to absorb more leftist kind of energy under the Democrats' kind of big tent. And that's worrisome for me. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't have a larger insight into, what types of disagreements and things go on, inside of it. But from what I've been able to gather, it seems like they have some real, limitations too. But in terms of like what they say, in terms of like how they want to build out their strategy, seems to make sense. They've demonstrated some ability to win like some down ballot races, but they also seem to be super vulnerable to like a kind of careerism, right? In order to kind of maintain their own space on some of these ballots, they have to get in bed with some really bad Democrat support, some really reactionary shit that is very worrisome to me as well. So I think that what you're asking me is a real important question. And it's one I don't have the answer to, but I think it's something we got to figure out. And hopefully as we continue to organize and struggle, we'll get clarity on what some of the right pivots are.
So the only sort of pushback on that is regarding the Green Party, and I'm biased, is in addition to because of the meeting I just went to yesterday, is that and I don't think this is actually through yours or anyone else's fault, but what I would encourage is that you and I and others do more as media creators and consumers to push media creators to do more to cover the ongoing work of people doing Green Party or other various forms of alternative, because it isn't true actually that they only pop up every 4 years. What is often true is they only get attention for what they're doing every 4 years, to the extent they do. Not to absolve them of some of the flaws. I mean, they're not perfect. I just think that some of it is not just that they're not doing anything, it's they don't get attention for it. Now they do need to do more in the interim, and those of us who support these alternatives need to do more to support them. But I just wanted to throw that out there as well. So just everyone, let's encourage our favorite media outlets to check in on their local Green Party or Party for Socialism and Liberation chapter, or whoever, you know what I mean, whoever's doing whatever, or those trying to form new parties, you know, which I still think, I go back and forth, should we infiltrate the Greens in a positive way, that is, and take advantage of the existing structure,
right,
or just create something new. But I really do appreciate the point that we can't just cede the space, because that's where so many people that we would end up needing to engage are. And then I also just want to throw out there again, and I know you've seen this and others have seen this, a lot of folks that talk a lot of ish about their radical positioning quietly go off and vote for these lesser of evils all the time. So my point being, it's like a lot of, it's like, so we can't just have the tough talk for I don't care about voting and it's more than voting and you can't vote, you're not going to vote out settler colonialism. Like, you can't just say that without having some sort of alternative, because a lot of people who either say that or have an affinity for those politics, they be in there quietly.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So it's like,
quiet as kept.
Let's go ahead and have some option that we
That's
can
right.
really push for them. And then when they really don't vote for that option, we can say, now come on now. Yeah. So listen, is there anything else that you're doing that you would want to promote or talk about, or anything from the article that we didn't draw out or I didn't draw out that you would want to make sure we get to? Or anything you want to, invite us to think about before we check back in with you for another discussion?
Yeah, I think in closing, the main thing that I really want to throw out is just to underscore, like, we really got to get back to class struggle as it relates to like organizing like labor. Right? Like, that's where we as workers are able to flex, you know what I'm saying, and demonstrate and exert our most powerful expression of ourselves, as workers. I think all of the other kinds of demonstrations and protests are necessary and powerful as a way to galvanize and quicken sensibilities and consciousness. But we have to make sure that those types of protests are providing entry points, right, into struggle for folks to fight, one, as labor, and also like as a part of like some of these real kind of like campaigns, whether it be like housing or healthcare, or like against like state violence. Like, we have to find and identify these entry points into struggle. If we do not, then what's going to happen is you'll have folks that'll be quickly mobilized but not organized, right? And then they will, rise up for a moment or three and then go back to, where they came from. So we really have to make sure that we are having like our revolutionary organizations out there in the mix with easy entry and access points into struggle. With that being said, a group that I really want to highlight, and we mentioned them in the article, is like Black Workers for Justice, which is part of this larger coalition called the Southern Worker Assembly, that's like spread out across industry, across states, that are really driving and developing, trying to build out this cadre of workers that can fight and organize at the point of production, and not just for like bread and butter things like benefits and wages, but are engaging in real political education in terms of like, how do you fight fascism? How do we build solidarity against all of these imperial theaters of war? Like, how do we combat anti-Black state violence? And what does that have to do with, building out this new warehouse in Kentucky for, etc. Right? So I think like labor organizing in groups like that is going to be central, and that we really just have to make sure that revolutionary organizations are out there on front, so when people do get mobilized, they can get channeled into organizational homes so they can continue to build and grow. I think if there's any benefit that a Trump administration is going to bring is he's going to constantly be outraging folks, right? Like he's going to be doing shit that's going to constantly have people up in arms. And just like we saw previously, like people are going to take to the streets for that, right? The real crucial project for the left right now is making sure that we can absorb those folks with easy, accessible entry points into struggle so we can sustain and harness that momentum and grow people's political imaginations and appetites for struggle.
Right on, my man. I appreciate you. Any chance we could get another poem on the way out? Is that possible? Am I pushing it?
Yeah.
And while he's pulling that up, everybody, we're gonna let D Noble close us out this morning. Please do like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon. We are permanently demonetized, but that doesn't stop you from immaterially supporting through likes and shares and comments, and materially supporting through Patreon and blackliberationmedia.org. So please do whatever you can. The link to the article in question is in the show description. And of course, that is Lessons from Decades of Black and Palestinian Organizing, co-authored by Chenjerai Kumanyika and our guest this morning, Demetrius Noble. So please check that out as well. And yeah, and if you're ready, we turn it over. And thanks again, my man. It's always it's a pleasure, and peace, because I know you willing to fight for it. So yeah, here we go. Go ahead,
man. It was my pleasure. So thank you for having me on to share space with you, man. It's always beautiful to build with you, my brother. This last piece I'm gonna do, hopefully it'll kind of bring us out on a more hopeful note. I think it's also a pertinent piece when we think about the amount of conversation that went on around like reproductive justice and whatnot during this previous election cycle and the failures of both parties to deliver. But this piece is entitled Somewhere. And I want to read a short little epigraph from D.G. Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams, before I get into it. Trying to envision somewhere in advance of nowhere, as poet Jane Cortez puts it, is an extremely difficult task, yet it is a matter of great urgency. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. Somewhere. Somewhere, women are just women, femmes are femmes, non-binary and non-gender conforming folks take up all the space they desire to on the elongated spectrum of radiant, brilliant human beauty. They don't have to remind you of their pronouns. They can walk around freely in their own bodies without fear of being assaulted, because we will have abolished rape culture and the systems of patriarchy that upheld it for far too long. In this new world, when Black and brown girls declare "Me Too," that will be their response to their mothers who are telling them, "I'm glad we organized and fought to crush capitalism so we could eat, live, learn, laugh, love, sing, and be happy." Somewhere, abortions are not only legal, they are free. For we have dismantled the oppressive state apparatuses that only benefited that parasitic clique known as the ruling class. We rid ourselves of the vestiges of the backwards ideologies and religious theologies that sought to strip women of their bodily autonomy. Somewhere, The black girl magic and womanist wonder and unbridled joy access via the praxis of hot girl summers are not disrupted by coerced pregnancies in winter. Somewhere, reproductive justice is fully realized because we fought knowing there is no such thing as single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. We fought to birth healthy babies and not die. We fought to not go broke as soon as our water broke. We fought to not raise our children in dilapidated tenement buildings. We fought to have safe neighborhoods and took back our streets for our kids to play in after we made police obsolete. We fought to have fully funded schools with revolutionary curriculums so our children would be the continuum that sustains this leftist momentum. We fought for full employment and living wages. We fought for open borders and no kids in cages. We fought for the earth so our kids could run, skip, jump, and inhale clean air. And when we didn't want kids, we fought to abort legally and freely with the best health care. Somewhere, this, yes, all of this shall happen. Somewhere, this is more than just the pie in the sky of a socialist utopia. Somewhere, could be here if we fight to make it real.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
What do you sacrifice? Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, they set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy and defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.